Under the cold light of a ceremony commemorating the victory over fascism, a young president from West Africa stepped onto Russia's red carpet. There was no blaring music, no extravagant displays, only the firm sound of footsteps echoing across the stone square of the Kremlin. The May breeze gently brushed the red and gold flags, quivering in the hands of silver-haired veterans. They stood motionless, like monuments, but in their deep eyes, the past was awakening. President Ibrahim Traoré held his head high as the national anthem of Burkina Faso rang out, blending with the deep tones of Russia's military band. He was still young, sharp-eyed, high-browed, his uniform perfectly pressed. But beneath that fabric was a heart that had seen blood and fire. Today, he did not come seeking aid, nor to give grand speeches. He came as a soldier to bow before the past and rise for the future. Across the square, the Russian leader approached, offering a warm, steady handshake. Together, they entered Alexander Hall, a place woven into the memory of the Great Patriotic War. On the walls, oil paintings of Red Army soldiers' snow settling on their shoulders, eyes burning with resolve as they marched toward Berlin. Traoré paused before one painting, a black soldier wearing a French insignia lying in a snow-covered forest. That man, the Russian leader said softly, was one of 30,000 Burkinabe who fought under Charles de Gaulle. The room fell silent, as though history itself had placed a hand on Traoré's shoulder. When the official ceremony began, the world turned its eyes to Moscow. On the honorary platform, heads of state sat in solemn stillness. Traoré wore his olive-green uniform, the Burkina Faso coat of arms hand-stitched on his chest. As the historic tanks rolled by from World War II's T-34 to modern armored vehicles, his gaze narrowed. But it wasn't the past he saw. His eyes were fixed on home, where rusting trucks still rumbled through the Sahel-facing terrorists wielding Cold War-era rifles. That evening, at a modest yet dignified diplomatic reception, Traoré spoke. His voice was steady, not loud. "We have not come to speak only of the past. We come to learn from your unyielding spirit, from how a small nation defeated a cruel force with loyalty and intellect." He spoke of the scorched villages in northern Burkina Faso, of broken schools of young nurses operating by lantern light. But he also spoke of the Mandela Institute, a new national training center where Burkinabe youth were learning to design machines to code to apply agricultural science. "We are not asking for fish," he concluded. "We are asking to learn how to make the hook." The Russian leader responded without pomp, but with weight. He announced that Russia would continue providing food aid wheat cooking oil and expand full scholarships for Burkinabe students. A Russian university branch would be considered for Ouagadougou. More importantly, a new agreement for transferring technology in health, agriculture, and defense would begin negotiations within the month. Outside, snowflakes danced, though May had already come. Traoré stood alone on a high Kremlin balcony. He looked down at the slow-moving crowd leaving the parade grounds, his hands tightening around the stone railing. Moments later, an aide approached and whispered, "Mr. President, the Russian ambassador in Burkina Faso has just confirmed our supply route in the Sahel was ambushed. 14 soldiers are dead." The wind ceased. In that instant, there was no more celebration, no diplomacy. Only a soldier standing between two worlds, the light of hope and the shadow of reality. The sky over Ouagadougou was as scorched as the ground beneath. The Harmattan wind brushed past the skeletal cotton trees, sweeping dust into every fold of clothing, into every wound the land had yet to heal. At President Traoré's feet lay the uneven earth of a once peaceful village, now reduced to rubble and bullet casings. Charred walls, collapsed roofs from a shelling 3 weeks prior. The people had returned not because it was safe, but because there was nowhere else to go. A mother brought her 2 young children before him. The older one, no more than 8, had sun-bleached hair and eyes far too old for his face. The younger clung to his mother's dress, wearing a frayed baby shirt. She did not cry, her tears had long run dry. Her voice was low and slow, as if each word carried the weight of a grave. My husband was a teacher. They came before dawn, shot him in the classroom in front of the children. Traoré stood silent. Fists clenched his eyes, never leaving the child. The boy stared back, unflinching, tearless, and asked a single question. "Can you promise they won't kill my mother too?" That question landed like an unexploded bullet lodged deep, waiting to detonate. That day, the president walked for 3 miles through the ruins without convoys or cameras. He paused before a destroyed school once marked maths class. The blackboard was split in two, but a line of chalk still read 1 + 1 = 2, a final scratch of hope. He bent down and picked up a student's notebook, tiny letters written between smears of dried blood. Back in the capital, he called an emergency meeting. In a room awash with cold white light, generals, ministers, and advisors gathered. No one spoke until he did. "We are losing our homeland village by village, school by school, soul by soul. They do not only want land, they want our memory. They want to erase the belief that our children can read, that they can dream." He paused, then spoke not as a president, but as a father. "I made a promise to a child, and I do not break promises." That night, alone in his study, Traoré unfurled a map across the table. Red dots marked territories seized by terrorist factions. Each dot was a lost child, a grieving mother, a burned classroom. But he did not stare at the red. His eyes stopped on a single green dot, the Mandela Institute, the only place in the north still powered, still full of books, still dreaming. The next morning he visited the institute. No ceremony, no media, just the echo of a lecture spilling from a makeshift classroom in an old shipping container. A young teacher was explaining renewable energy. In the corner, a small solar-powered fan spun slowly. A student stood when he saw the president. "Sir," the student said, "we don't have much. But if you give us time, we'll build generators, water purifiers, tractors for farmers." The president smiled and answered softly, "I won't give you time. I'll give you a generation." On the ride back, his aide handed him the latest report. 3 more regions fallen that week. An old general called voice hoarse, "We need to strike back, gun soldiers." But Traoré folded the phone without replying. Back in his office, he looked up at an old photograph on the wall himself as a young soldier wearing a faded uniform, gripping an AK-47. Next to him stood a close friend now buried. Underneath the photo was a line of text: "The homeland does not need survivors. It needs those who do not give up." As the city lights flickered on, Traoré closed his eyes. In that dim silence, the child's voice from that morning echoed in his mind, each word etched like a scar across the soul. At the heart of Ouagadougou, behind high fences topped with barbed wire, the Mandela Institute stood like a stubborn sprout in dry soil. Its walls were made of corrugated metal and poured concrete, ugly to the eye, but beautiful to those who believed in beginnings. It was not the size of the building that mattered, but the noise inside. The kind of noise made by pencils, scratching formulas, by voices practicing Russian syllables, by the hum of makeshift machines being brought to life with solar wires and repurposed batteries. President Traoré arrived just before noon without escort or ribbon. He wore plain fatigues and carried a folder under his arm. The students didn't know he was coming. When they saw him step into the courtyard, their surprise turned to silence, then applause, not for a head of state, but for one of their own. A tall, dark-skinned professor with wire-rimmed glasses hurried forward. "Mr. President," he said breathlessly, "you honor us." "No," Traoré replied quietly, "you honor me." He walked through classrooms, narrow halls packed with young minds and broken fans. On one wall, painted in bold red letters, were the words, "The future is not inherited. It is built." In a mechanical workshop, students were assembling what looked like a crude water purifier. It was bulky, clumsy, and leaking slightly, but it worked. A young woman in a blue lab coat demonstrated the system. "This can filter 5 gallons an hour," she said proudly, using only sun and sand. "What's your name?" he asked. "Isatu, sir." "How old are you, Isatu? 20. And where is your family?" Her smile faltered. "In the east. But they are not all alive." He nodded solemnly. "And yet you are here. That is why we will win." In the main lecture hall, students had gathered in anticipation. Word had spread the president would speak. Traoré walked slowly to the podium, placed the folder before him, and looked out not at the room but into it. These weren't just students. They were orphans of war children, of farmers, survivors of exile. And they were his hope. "You were not meant to succeed," he began, "not by those who drew the maps of our suffering. They expected your minds to be empty, and your futures to be silent. But you came here to learn to fight with knowledge, to defend your country with intellect." He paused, letting the words sink in. "In Russia, I saw machines I had only read about. I saw laboratories with tools so advanced they seemed like fiction. And I made a promise to bring that power home, not as charity, but as partnership." Then he opened the folder and held up a document. "This is the agreement. We will build the first Russian-African scientific branch right here. They will send professors, engineers, doctors, but the ones who will lead it will be you." The room erupted. Cheers, tears, hands raised in disbelief. Some students wept openly. One of them, a boy barely 16, whispered, "I don't need to leave my country to become something." As Traoré left the hall, a journalist caught up to him outside. "Mr. President," she asked, "is this the beginning of an African Renaissance?" He didn't answer directly. He looked over the wall at the dry hills beyond where goats grazed and children played beside broken wells. "No," he said at last. "This is the end of believing we must beg to be educated." That night, as the Institute's solar panels dimmed and the generator shut down for curfew, a single light remained on in the administrative building. It was Isatu sketching a blueprint by hand, her eyes fierce, her pencil moving fast. And far away beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, a group of men met in secret. On their screen was a photo of the Institute, the president's speech, and the signed agreement. One man murmured, "They're waking up." Another replied coldly, "Then we must act before they rise." The report landed on his desk like a stone tossed into still water. It was thin, only 12 pages, but each line carried the weight of a storm yet to break. President Traoré sat in his office long past sunset, the usual hum of generators outside replaced by silence. Only the clicking of a ceiling fan and the low flicker of lamplight accompanied him. The file was marked "Confidential. Eyes only." Inside were photographs, bank transfers, intercepted messages. But it was the names that cut deepest. Government advisors, a member of parliament, a former comrade from his days in uniform, men who had once stood beside him during campaigns, who had toasted beside his mother's grave. Now they were taking money from foreign accounts, funding sabotage, feeding information to factions who sought to destabilize the country from within. He did not slam the desk. He did not curse. Instead, he simply leaned back in his chair and whispered, "So, it begins." Earlier that week, a shipment of medical equipment bound for the Mandela Institute had vanished en route. The driver was found alive, terrified, and unwilling to speak. A week before that, a communications satellite dish meant for a rural hospital was mysteriously destroyed in a warehouse fire. The accidents were no longer accidents. Someone was pulling the threads, slowly unraveling the nation's fragile hope. Traoré summoned his intelligence chief, Colonel Sambo, a man with cold eyes and a colder voice. They met in the old bunker beneath the presidential compound, a relic from the colonial days now repurposed as a war room. On the wall was a map with red pins marking regions under threat. But now there were yellow pins, too, symbolizing compromised officials. "We are bleeding from within," Sambo said flatly. "These men aren't just traitors. They are nodes connected to something larger." Foreign, Traoré asked. Sambo nodded. "At least 3 nations have been mentioned in their messages, 2 corporations, 1 religious charity, all posing as friends." Traoré closed his eyes, not in weariness, but calculation. Then it's not sabotage. It's siege warfare. That evening he held a closed-door session with his inner circle. No phones, no press, just him, 6 trusted ministers, and a grim understanding. "We are not fighting men in the bush anymore," he said. "We are fighting ghosts in suits, contracts written in bloodless ink, smiles sharpened like knives." He paused, then placed a photograph on the table. A man in a gray suit shaking Traoré's hand at a UN conference just a year before. This man, he said softly, approved a funding package last month for agricultural development. But this same man also funded the mercenaries who raided our farmers. A long silence followed. No one breathed. "They want to fracture us," he continued, "to turn ministers into informants, teachers into skeptics, children into commodities. This is not just corruption, it is war with silk gloves." The room grew darker as a storm rolled in outside. Thunder cracked over Ouagadougou like distant artillery. A power flicker passed through the room, but the lights held. That night in a villa on the outskirts of the city, a lavish dinner was underway. Men in expensive shirts passed around wine and whispered over cigars. In a side room, a screen displayed the president's recent speech at the Mandela Institute. "He's getting too bold," one man said. "He's convincing them they don't need us," another replied. A third man, older, raised his glass. "Then let's remind him what happens when you plant seeds in poisoned soil." Meanwhile, back in the palace, Traoré stood on the balcony watching the rain. Lightning lit up the city skyline, and for a moment he saw his reflection in the glass, young, fierce, yet tired. He knew the storm ahead would not only be fought with guns, it would be fought with information, with influence, with betrayal in broad daylight. As he turned to go back inside, Colonel Sambo approached quietly. "There's one more name, sir," he said, handing over a separate folder. Traoré opened it slowly, and there it was, at the bottom of the page, a familiar face, a friend, a brother, a man who had stood beside him just weeks ago, grinning in a photograph. He did not speak. The only sound was the thunder rolling endlessly, as if the heavens themselves were issuing a warning. The convoy moved before dawn, headlights dimmed, engines hushed, rolling through the dust like a procession of ghosts, tanks retrofitted with Russian armor, trucks packed with rations, bandages, and letters from mothers. Young men with rifles, too many of them barely 20, stared ahead in silence, their breath rising like steam in the cold desert air. President Traoré stood at the northern command post, watching the columns stretch into the horizon. He wore his uniform not as a symbol, but as a bond, a silent pledge that he would not send others where he wouldn't go himself. Beside him, Commander Diallo unfurled a hand-drawn map on the bonnet of a jeep. "We strike before noon," he said. "We'll hit their southern flank. If we hesitate, they'll vanish like smoke." Traoré nodded, but his eyes were scanning the far hills. "No, we wait. Let the sun rise first. Let them think we've gone soft." Then he added quietly, "Let them see us coming." Just after 8, gunfire cracked the stillness. The assault began. In the valley of Yalgado, where thorn bushes outnumber trees and every stone hides an old story, the fight turned brutal. The enemy had trenches dug into dry riverbeds. They used children as lookouts, elderly men as shields. But the Burkinabe forces moved with purpose. For every step back they took 2 forward. Traoré remained at the field base, directing movements, voice calm, even as shells screamed overhead. Then the radio call came. Unit Bravo hit. Casualties. Yarrow's down. For a second, everything stopped. Not the war, not the shouting, just something in Traoré's face, a flicker. Yarrow was 19. He had trained at the Mandela Institute before volunteering for frontline duty. He had written Traoré a letter last month saying, "I want to be part of the change you promised." When they found Yarrow, he was still breathing, barely. Blood soaked his tunic. His eyes fluttered open as Traoré knelt beside him, taking his hand. I tried, sir," he whispered. Traoré leaned in close. "You did more than try. You gave us ground to stand on." Yarrow tried to smile, then slipped away. That night the troops held the line. The enemy retreated into the cliffs, dragging their wounded, leaving behind crates of ammunition foreign-marked pristine. A clear message someone somewhere was still feeding this fire. At camp, the soldiers gathered around a makeshift memorial. A photo of Yarrow. A pair of boots. His helmet dented, but still whole. No one spoke. The wind did all the speaking, sifting through broken leaves and scattered bullet shells. Back in Ouagadougou, the public was told of the victory and the cost. Families mourned, but they also lit candles, painted Yarrow's name on the walls, wrote songs for the fallen. Meanwhile, inside the presidential war room, Traoré faced his closest advisors. "They want to wear us down," he said. "But they've misunderstood who we are. We are not made to last. We are made to rise." He turned to Colonel Sambo. "The Russians are offering a new defensive technology, drone sensors, motion surveillance. They've agreed to deploy advisors, not soldiers." "And you trust them?" a minister asked. "No," Traoré said. "But I trust the dream they've invested in because they've seen it before in their own history, and they know what happens when people stop begging and start building." Later that night, Traoré walked the perimeter of the field base. The stars above were bright, cruel, beautiful. One of the younger soldiers approached, hesitating. "Sir," he said, "was Yarrow scared?" Traoré looked at him for a long time, then replied, "He wasn't scared of dying. He was scared of dying before we finished what we started." The soldier nodded, then walked back to his tent. Behind him, the president stood alone, watching the wind carry fine dust across the plains. Just before dawn, a secure message came through from Moscow. "New equipment en route. Coordinates confirmed. One final note. They are listening to you, and they are afraid." Rain fell gently over Ouagadougou, the kind that settles into the cracks of red earth, softens the silence, and lets the dead rest. It was the first storm of the season, and the first time in months that the city heard something other than gunfire or grief. On a hill just beyond the city limits, a modest crowd had gathered. No cameras, no diplomats, only villagers, students, and soldiers in clean uniforms. There was no podium, no anthem, no speech. President Traoré stood with a shovel in hand, wearing a simple white tunic. He reached down, pressed a young tree's roots into the softened earth, and began to cover them slowly, silently, with bare hands. It was a tamarind tree, not chosen for its beauty, but for its endurance. Behind him, a group of schoolchildren stood barefoot in the mud, holding paper flags and folded notes. One stepped forward, a girl no older than 10. She wore a blue dress, her hair tied in careful braids. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she read a short poem. "My father worked the land with no machines. My mother taught numbers under a mango tree. Now I see machines arrive, and new numbers lighting screens. Let the past rest. Let the future grow." Silence followed, heavy and sacred. Then the wind came gentle through the branches, as if the tree itself had heard. Over the following days, the people of Burkina Faso began to feel the shift. In villages once held by militants, women returned to markets. Teachers came back to classrooms, dusting off blackboards with trembling hands. Generators were installed in rural clinics. Radio towers were raised, broadcasting programs on literacy, health, and engineering. And in the capital, a building rose, not high, not grand, but firm. The Russian African Scientific Institute opened its doors in August, staffed by engineers from Moscow and professors from Ouagadougou. Its walls bore murals of Sankara Mandela and unnamed village teachers. In the main lecture hall, a quote from Yarrow was etched in iron above the stage. "Don't ask how long it takes. Ask how far we've come." Traoré visited the institute quietly, often, without announcement. In one such visit, he passed by a robotics lab where a girl no older than 15 was soldering wires into a small machine. "What are you building?" he asked. "A mechanical planter," she said. To help my mother sow faster. He nodded. And what will you do next? She hesitated, then smiled. I want to build bridges. Between where and where? She looked up, eyes wide. Between here and the future. Elsewhere, the new educational charter was signed, a declaration drafted jointly by Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea. It stated that African nations would develop their own curricula in their own languages, rooted in science, history, and dignity. Traoré did not sign with pomp. He signed with quiet hands before a group of young students and whispered only, "May this never be undone." But victory did not erase the cost. At the National Cemetery, rows of simple gravestones stood beneath ironwood trees. Mothers came to weep, fathers to plant flowers. On one grave, someone had left a letter, folded carefully, written in pencil. It read, "You didn't die for us to cry forever. You died so we would know how to stand." That night from the presidential residence, Traoré stood again on his balcony. The city pulsed below electric raw, still healing. In his hand was a small piece of paper torn from a child's notebook. The words were scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I want to be an engineer." He folded it, placed it into the breast pocket of his shirt, and whispered, "You will." The rain came again, soft as breath, and somewhere beneath the hill outside the city, a tamarind tree drank its first deep draught from the roots of a land that had chosen at last to grow.